Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special episode of the Newshour tonight. Tonight, when we are looking back at 30 years of liberalisation, how the landscape has changed, whether it is economic status of India or whether it is the political economy of India, how things have moved on from that fateful day in 1991 till today, the lessons that we've learned, the road that we still need to traverse and pick up from where the goals have not been achieved right up to the 100% that were imagined. And I have a distinguished panel joining me tonight, people who have seen the liberalisation in 1991 from very close quarters and people who have been part of the changing landscape of India's economic policy making as well as decision making, and of course who are well versed with how this economics really blends with the politics of the country. Join me in welcoming Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, who was a joint secretary at the time when in July 1991 the decision to usher in a period of liberalisation was taken. Thank you, Mr. N.K. Singh, for joining me here on the Newshour tonight.
Thank you, Navika.
Also joining me tonight, Mr. Uday Kotak, MD and CEO of Kotak Mahindra Bank. Who doesn't know him and his expertise, not just in the banking sector, but very close brushes with how political decision-making and policy-making takes place. Thank you, Mr. Uday Kotak, for joining me here on the Newshour. Also with us tonight is Nandan Nilekani, co-founder and chairman of Infosys and founding chairman of Uday. And of course, chapter and verse has been written about Nandan Nilekani, including his foray into politics. Also with us this evening is Dr. Shankar Acharya, former Chief Economic Advisor, in fact the longest serving Chief Economic Advisor in the Finance Ministry in history of India. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. And let me begin rightfully with Mr. N.K. Singh. On July 24th, 1991, the year and the date when liberalisation was ushered into the Indian landscape of economic decision-making. Mr. N.K. Singh, was it really something that we had to do and we had no option, or was this a choice made by Dr. Manmohan Singh at that time and backed, as everybody does appreciate, P.V. Narasimha Rao, the Prime Minister then?
Well, that's a very difficult question, Navika, because if you look at what happened in 1990, the incipient signs of the crisis had really begun to occur much earlier. During the 60s and 70s, India accepted a low-level equilibrium trap, low levels of economic growth, tolerated high-level inflation. But during the 90s, before the 90s, the decision was taken in the 80s that perhaps you could really have high rates of economic growth through enhanced public outlays. Enhanced public outlays financed both through domestic borrowing, but more importantly, through external commercial borrowing. And because the terms of external commercial borrowing during that period had hardened from deteriorating from 89% coming by way of concessional flows to less than 80% coming as concessional flows, coupled with other geopolitical events, in a certain sense made 1991 a crisis waiting to happen. Efforts made by the Chandrasekhar government earlier during that period had yielded, no doubt, just about enough to tide over this particular problem. You remember the sale of gold, or rather the mortgaging of gold for being able to contract the necessary amounts of external borrowing, some other decisions to be taken, and discussions between the International Monetary Fund and the IMF. So in a certain sense of the term, when Dr. Manmohan Singh assumed office in June, this was a crisis just waiting to happen. It was as much borne out by the compulsions of the time at the needs to do and take corrective action, both on fiscal and on structural measures.
Mr. Uday Kotak, there are some numbers that my research team has really crunched for us. And I want to put out these statistics, not just because these are statistics which are not related to each other, but I want to understand the story that these statistics really reveal to us today. The average home loan rate has come down from 9.8% in 1995 to about 8.4% in 2020. It went down lower to 7.5 or 7.8 somewhat, but it's come back up again. Outstanding home loans have shot up from 1.1% of GDP in 1990 to 9.8% of GDP in 2020. Percentage share of workers in agriculture has reduced from almost 65% to about 44% now. Workers in services and manufacturing combined have increased from 38 to about 56%. What does this tell us really about the liberalization road that we took? Have we really achieved our goals, or are we still struggling somewhere?
So, Navika, last 30 years, starting with 1991, have been transformative for India's economic history. There's no doubt about it. And I have to compliment the team. At least two of them are here, which is N.K. Singh and Dr. Shankar Acharya, who have been a very important part of this journey. And I must compliment them for the roles they have played. Coming to your specific point, Navika, you started by home loan rates. I just wanted to highlight to you that as we speak today, the home loan rates are now down to 6.65 to 6.75%. So that is the level to which rates have dropped in interest rates. So there is a very significant improvement in the interest rate situation of India compared to the 90s. But you also have to keep in mind that the world interest rates have also come down. And therefore, there is a correlation between the global economy and the Indian economy. And India also is concerned to be much more, is assumed to be much more stable an economy with strong foreign exchange reserves, as a result of which the premium which foreigners expect of the rupee depreciation has also shrunk. As a result of which, global interest rates are very low. As you know, in Europe and US, they're close to zero at the short end. And India, therefore, has also responded by very low interest rates. And the pandemic has pushed down interest rates further. So I think we have made progress. But like we see over the last 30 years, and the statistic you gave, many areas have improved significantly. However, we must keep in mind the road ahead is also got to be traversed. When the Prime Minister Modi gives a clarion call for a 5 trillion economy, we have to read the meaning behind it. India's per capita GDP today is around $2,000 per capita. This makes us below middle income countries. If we have to go to even doubling our GDP, we will have to cross the $5 trillion GDP absolute. Therefore, we have traversed a long road, but we have a long and tough road ahead.
Nandan, Nilekani, there was a phase when import duties were just so high, and then came in this era of liberalization, and we saw import duties coming down. We saw protectionism giving way, to more competition and more worldwide brands being seen in India. Some amount of competition being impacting the survival of Indian companies. And we've seen this happening over a period of time. I want to ask you, how do you assess India Inc., corporate India, in terms of how it has dealt with liberalization, which started in 1991, the lessons that still remain to be learned, given the fact that we saw a period where there was a lot of euphoria about investment, about India being a destination, and production, manufacturing, everything was going up. We've gone up from the Hindu rate of growth of around 4% and touched the 8s and the 9s, and sometimes just fleetingly even 10%. But once again, growth has become an issue, investments have become an issue, and corporate India shying away from taking that step forward. How do you see corporate India having changed over the last 30 years?
Well, I think corporate India, by and large, has responded very well to economic reforms and competition. When the reforms were being planned, there were a set of people who perhaps felt that Indian industry needed more protection, and that's what the so-called the Bombay Club was. But today, I think every Indian company realizes that they are part of the global economy. They have to compete globally. They have to export. They have to compete with foreign companies in India. And I think they've become very, very resilient. And certainly the pandemic also, we have seen very good performance by Indian companies. I think also Indian companies have gained hugely with the reforms of the capital markets. I mean, one of the little lesser discussed aspects of the reforms was the abolishing of the Office of the Controller of Capital Issues, who was the bureaucrat sitting in Delhi who decided the price at which you sold your shares. Imagine telling that to a young guy who's tapping on his smartphone and buying Zomato IPO on a Zerodha account. To tell him that actually the price was being fixed by a bureaucrat would be quite, they would find it quite stunning. This was abolished on August 1992, and SEBI was set up. And in fact, Infosys was probably the first company to do an IPO with the new liberalized pricing. So capital markets opened up dramatically, and many of the stars of today, whether it's Kotak Mahindra Bank or whether it's HDFC Bank, are all post-liberalization, children of post-liberalization who came up and succeeded and also raised a lot of capital in the market. So I think Indian companies have taken to it very well. They are very, very competitive and they are very globalized. But I think, as Uday said, to go from where we are, of a $2 trillion economy to a $5 trillion economy is going to be the challenge. Most countries have a challenge when they're going from middle income to higher income. We have seen what happened in Latin America, where many countries have not been able to break out of it. So the real thing now is how do we build on the extraordinary reforms of the last 30 years and continue to build a per capita income to get to $5 trillion as soon as possible.
There is an attention that is drawn to bureaucracy, and I want to dwell on bureaucracy versus the political decision-making process between you and Mr. N.K. Singh. You've been pretty much Mr. N.K. Singh on both sides of the spectrum, but Dr. Shankar Acharya, was the implementation of the liberalization move in 1991 carried to the full level that it was expected to be? Was the implementation tardy? Did it meet the objectives that it set out to really achieve? Do you think really it was Dr. Manmohan Singh? And I want a comparison on Dr. Manmohan Singh. As Finance Minister, backed by a very, very solid Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, who fought the political battles while Dr. Manmohan Singh concentrated on the economic policy making. His role, between his time as Finance Minister and then as the Prime Minister between 2004 and 14.
Okay, I mean, that's a lot of questions and across a rather wide spectrum. Let me, if I may, Navika, start with your last and the political question, if you like. And it's not an easy one to answer while saying something and without rubbing some people the wrong way. But my view, my kind of frank and honest view would be that Dr. Manmohan Singh was a superb finance minister during those 5 years between 1991 and 96. He gave terrific leadership to the finance ministry and the team that he had assembled around him, including K and myself, of course, but many others like Montague and Rajan at the RBI and so forth. And he, of course, was also a great team player. But in particular, he, I think, interacted very constructively with the Prime Minister, Mr. Rao, who, of course, on these issues tended to stay a little bit in the background. and the Prime Minister's very able Principal Secretary, Amarnath Verma. So I think that whole team at that time, and cutting across from finance to commerce and industry and the Reserve Bank of India, I think was very well functioning. And this also touches on the implementation issue that you talked about. I think, in a sense, when I look back at that time and I look at matters afterwards, either in the 2000s or in the last decade or whatever, I don't sense that same degree of cohesion across the key ministries at the top civil servant come technocratic level. Maybe it's there, maybe I'm out of it and therefore don't know. But I think that in that sense, there was something very special going on. Now, as I said, a lot of the leadership came from, on all this came from Dr. Singh. But I have to say that the UPA decade and I may be losing friends as I say this, the UPA decade of 2004 to 2014, when Dr. Singh was a Prime Minister, but let us not forget he was in a sense an appointed Prime Minister, with the President of the Congress Party being Sonia Gandhi, that in many ways I think, at least for me, on the economic side, there was some disappointment. If you look to identify the big productivity increasing reforms during that decade, there aren't that many. There was terrific things on the political side, for example, the US civil nuclear deal and so on, and a number of other things. But on the economic side, I think the actual array of reforms done during that decade, when Dr. Singh was the Prime Minister, was not that impressive. And I think we have, to some extent, we've paid the price for that afterwards. People assume that, there's something called a switch called reforms. You turn it on and some little engine purrs somewhere, which is output goes up, exports goes up, or something like that. Well, it's not at all like that. Sometimes these things have a lag, and several years lag. And that is where I give enormous credit to the Rao-Singh combination, as well as, if I may, the Bajpai, Yashwant Sinha, Jaswant Singh combinations. I think those two governments, one of 5 years and then the NDA one of 6 years, NDA one, I think together, and with the United Front in between for 2 years, really set a lot of reforms, put them out there, made them happen, a lot of them anyway, and in a sense set the basis for the very strong performance that we saw in the years in terms of growth, for example, in terms of 2003 to 2010-11, when we grew at an average rate of 8% plus. But even though the growth was high, poverty alleviation was pretty high and all pretty good, very good, actual reforms during that period were not consistently strong and decisive. And I think that is one reason why, since those years, we've not had that much. It's been a little bit up and down if you look at our economic track record. Do I sort of answer your questions?
Absolutely, and you've set the cat amongst the pigeons, because Mr. N.K. Singh, Mr. Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, Dr. Shankar Acharya wants to be or has always wanted to be out of controversies, and he's been very guarded when he says that he doesn't want to lose some of his friends that he's made over the last few decades. But he has made a statement which is extremely important, and I want to look at it from a political economy student point of view. And he does say that 2004 to 2014, the decisions taken by Dr. Manmohan Singh, an appointed Prime Minister, in the economic arena really haven't set Switzerland on fire. And that is the price we are still continuing to pay. That gives us an opening into looking at where we stand today after those 3 decades of liberalisation. And Mr. N.K. Singh, I want your view on that. The fact that we're still, as Aam Aadmi, looking at high petroleum product prices, that we're still looking at high edible oil prices, that we are after COVID again looking at people slipping below the poverty line. Where is the problem? Where can we figure out this problem to have its roots in?
So I think that one wouldn't disagree too much with Shankar. In fact, if I recall in a certain spirit, Dr. Manmohan Singh, as Prime Minister, himself had once told me, at that time I was a member of Parliament, Manmohan Singh himself had told me that, N.K, I could achieve a lot because finance ministers are about as powerful as the Prime Minister chooses to make them. So it was the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao who decided to enable Dr. Manmohan Singh to achieve that rather difficult agenda of economic reforms, covering a wide gamut of subjects from issues of macroeconomic stability, fiscal policies, issues of debt, foreign exchange, to structural reforms in terms of a far-reaching legislative agenda. After that, for 10 years, I agreed that we somehow lost our way. Reforms has been a meandering process with fits and starts, until we picked up momentum again during the Vajpayee period. And I recall that some of the three important things, if today we are on this business, having this conversation, the important decisions taken during the Vajpayee period on telecom, on road connectivity, on the enactment of the first FRBM Act, in terms of many other changes, that period again picked up speed after Mr. Vajpayee. And then during that period, it again reigned in during the limbo. Prime Minister Mr. Modi has begun to pick up the gauntlet on three important ingredients. One, to ask the right question. 1991, were they complete, were they incomplete? Was the implementation tardy, or were they really elaborate? The fact remains that after 1993, when we got off the arrangement with the IMF and the World Bank, many things which we had agreed in the quarterly performance criteria, the commitments that we had given to the Bretton Woods institution remained unimplemented. Let me give you an example. The idea of the GST was part of the Article 4 consultations of that period. And it took really the panache of Dr. Manmohan Singh acting in panache of Mr. Narendra Modi acting in concert with Mr. Arun Jaitley to persuade the state, which was thought of even earlier, to have this far-reaching constitutional amendment in 2017. Take the issue of farm law. It was considered at that time, in 91 and 93, but it took Mr. Narendra Modi leadership take on a difficult decision of implementing farm laws even at the peak of competition. Take the issues of the factors of production, land, labor, capital, issues of the power reforms. Take the most important issues of getting out of the mindset of believing in privatization, believing in the fact that you must allow room for private capital. Uday is here. Uday will realize that issue of after the bank nationalization was an issue which was an anathema to anybody to think of any change in the ownership structure of the public sector banks. And yet, in this last budget, we have begun the experiment with the privatization of two small banks to build on that experience. A bold statement has come that public sector undertakings need to vacate, except in strategic areas. Navika, this represents a mindset change. It represents shedding the baggage of the past and embracing the possibilities of the future, and harnessing technology in terms of the digital revolution. Nandan knows this much better, what it can do to agricultural productivity, what it can do to health, what it can do to education, what it can do to improve the life quality in multiple ways in which we can, in a gainful way, create employment opportunities based on these huge possibilities which artificial intelligence offers to us. In fact, the change in the pedagogy and the implementation of the new education policy, which, by the way, has also come after 20 years, coupled with harnessing this technological with possibility and the dream of a $5 trillion economy. Indeed, doubling per capita income is now a distinct technology with the changes.
You point out to the technological revolution. Before I get to Mr. Uday Kotak, I want to ask Nandan Nilekani about this. Nandan, how's your experience been? I mean, everybody now lauds the trinity of JAM, as it's talked about how direct benefit transfers, the UIDAI, the fact that there is digital transfer that's going on, whether it is the Kisan Samman Nidhi, whether it is, the Ayushman Bharat or, the Jan Dhan Yojana. But how difficult was it? Is there acceptability? Is the political part of the decision making easier than plowing through the bureaucratic red tape in changing systems? Because we're seeing that in a COVID hit world in India, education, which should have been digitized, should have had that backbone, doesn't really have it even today, 1.5 years after the pandemic struck us. How difficult is implementation of grand reformation packages in India?
Well, obviously, doing the transformation digitally is a complex activity because, one, you have to deal with the political angle of it, dealing with, various parties and so on. Then it is navigating it through the bureaucracy. And finally, the technology itself is very sophisticated and complex. But I think we were able to do that with the JAM Trinity. We have, and that has been a huge success. It has led to massive financial inclusion. More than 700 million people have Aadhaar-linked bank accounts. More than 1.3 billion people have Aadhaar. And during the pandemic, the government was able to transfer money in real time into over 100 million bank accounts using this DBT infrastructure. So these have all been huge benefits. Similarly, UPI platform has done a lot. UPI pre-demonetization was about 100,000 transactions in October of 2016. Today it's at 2.8 billion transactions. The RFID-based national FASTag system has made a huge impact. You can now travel on highways without getting down. You just drive by and the money is deducted from your bank account. GST India runs a fully online national GST platform. So I think while it is complex, while it is difficult to get all these things done, once they are done, they create a huge amount of value. Just one thing on the education, I believe a lot is happening. I mean, the Diksha program of the government actually provides digital learning capabilities to millions of children and teachers in the country and has been used very effectively by the Ministry of Education during the pandemic. So I believe that it is also used in education quite a bit, Navika, and I think the ministry has done a great job in using digital education. And then I think very importantly for the economic recovery, there's a huge digital part which is using the account aggregator network which has been put in by the RBI and the Ministry of Finance to enable small businesses to get credit, cash flow based lending from banks and NBFCs. And that can be done for all the suppliers on GEM marketplace or GSTN company or GSTN system. And that can be the key to economic recovery. So digital, and thanks to the Prime Minister who is very savvy on these things, digital has become central to India's reform.
Mr. Uday Kotak, I want to ask you, because one of the biggest issues that we've seen in recent time is the banking sector. The bad loans, as they are called, or the drag on the balance sheet of various banks, where more than 7 trillion rupees in bad loans show up, has created some sort of an issue, a hesitancy in terms of lending and in terms of really revving up the economy. We've seen a slowdown over the last, even before the pandemic, there was the slowdown that was taking its toll on the growth rates. And then, of course, when the pandemic struck us and the lockdown, etc., we've paid an economic cost of all of this. I want to ask you, how crucial is this reform of the banking sector, and will tiny steps of a couple of banks being privatized solve the problem? Do we have to really step on the accelerator? How do we as a country, as an economy, need to look at that problem?
See, Navika, I think it's a very important question you asked. And if you look back at the post-2007-8 period, where India went through massive investment cycles, some of it on the back of not necessarily strong fundamentals of the underlying projects, we saw a backlash of a huge amount of corporate loans given by banks to borrowers who did not deserve to borrow that money. And we saw the backlash of that starting sometime in 2013-14, and it spilled over into the new government. And it took time for really cleaning up this matter, and it is still not done. A significant amount of cleaning up has happened. You saw the introduction of IBC, and there is progress, but it is very, very slow. I think the important point in the banking sector reform is we need to ask ourselves the tough questions. In the last 6 to 8 years, particularly because of the backlash of the problems which arose prior to 2014, we have seen every segment of the financial sector go into trouble. First, if you look at the NBFC sector, we saw IL&FS, which was a 347 companies group monolith, which went into trouble after years of having basically not doing the right things, whether it was management, board, auditors, rating agencies, and even one may ask the question on regulatory oversight. So there was, in the NBFC sector, IL&FS. Then in the banking sector, you saw the challenges which came to Yes Bank, Lakshmi Vilas Bank, or even the PMC Bank. You saw a similar challenge in housing finance, which is Diwan Housing and Finance. You also saw the securities industry cleaned up post Karvi stockbrokers basically misusing client shares. So you saw a cleaning up happen over the last 5 to 8 years in many segments of finance. The question we have to ask is that now the medicine we put should not be worse than the disease. We need to put a medicine which actually takes us forward, makes us modern, embrace digital, at the same time be responsive to change and see how the world works in the financial sector. We at times tend to be in our own world, not recognizing that a lot of things around us have changed. And two important points in that context. One, I think in India, we really need to focus on what I call as execution. Return on time invested, or ROTI, is one of the big challenges which we face in terms of our decision-making process in the current and the past. So we need to quicken our pace, and the reason for that is pretty simple. The young generation is restless. It is looking for quicker change. The time is here, the time is now, and we are on times now.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's music to my ears. And Times Now actually wants to put, because our tagline is action begins here. And I want to put this. I want to put this out to the distinguished guests on the panel. Are we again at an inflection point, Mr. Uday Kotak? You know, 30 years ago, it was the move for liberalisation that was, the plunge was taken. But are we still liberalized enough? Are we seeing reduction of controls, or are we seeing a lot of overlap in terms of the political decision making, the the whole statement of more governance and less government? Has that really translated into reality? Farm laws, we talk of banking reforms, are they fast enough? Because we are once again, despite the political majority of the BJP in parliament, we are seeing a lot of stalling of decision making and reforms. So are we quite there, or do we need yet another injection of what we then called liberalisation reforms?
You know, Navika, there are two parts to this. One, we need to reform and increase incomes of our people. And second, if we want to be counted in the Committee of Nations around the world, we need to be of larger economic size. For our Prime Minister and our leadership to have a say on the world stage, we need to be much bigger than where we are. And we have to move at much quicker pace. I would support faster reform, much more open mindset from all players. Of course, business and practitioners also have to get far more open and more competitive. But I would really want a similar mindset from not only government, the bureaucracy, the regulators, a stronger judicial system which understands economic matters. Look at the backlog which we are seeing in IBC cases and other cases in the courts and the NCLT. We created an NCLT process for corporate resolution to move faster. It takes, in many cases, even longer than a normal court process through the NCLT process. We must improve our ROTI, return on time invested. We must move faster, execute, and not have fear. We need to take out this fear which many parts of the bureaucracy also have. And really go out there, take action. We will make mistakes, but as long as judgments are bona fide, we must move on fast.
Well, is that easier said than done, Dr. Shankar Acharya? Because we live in very cacophonic times. We should be able to take decisions, bona fide decisions. These days, even bona fide decisions are questioned, not just politically, but in courts, social media, digital platforms. So as far as pressures on decision making are concerned, they've only increased. How do you think we can overcome this pressure on decision making to make it move faster than it ever has been?
Well, that's a big one to try. But first of all, Navika, I want to very much endorse what Uday has just said, that it's critically important to increase the ROTE, as you put it, the return on time expended. And that's across different groups, whether it's bureaucracy, the political executive, business, and so forth. So I think that has to be done. Now, my thought on, what you're putting out there is a big problem. There isn't a simple solution. It's got to come from different places and in different parts. And it's not going to be easy. So let me not pretend that it will be. But this is where also leadership is very important, both at the political executive level and at the top of all the major agencies that have to deal with all this. And the point I would like to make as we move forward from what is essentially a very difficult situation created by the pandemic, lockdown, and so forth, which we all know about, is that apart from, of course, driving up what we're doing on vaccination, which in a way is a very important economic policy for us to revive our growth from where it has fallen or had fallen, I think I would look at it if I were today back trying to do the job that I used to do, that in the last few years, the present government has taken a number of major reform initiatives. Whether this be the IBC which is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code that Uday referred to, whether it is the new GST, which still has quite a few glitches and needs to be reformed further, whether it is the agricultural marketing legislation, which has run into some major political and other issues, or some people don't forget the whole business of the labor codes, kind of putting 140 laws into 4 codes. That has got to, the laws have passed, but until the rulemaking gets agreed to by the center and states, both, and that's all states, this is not going to be a done deal. So I could go on. But to me, it seems that a lot of major reforms have been done in the last few years. The time now is to really focus on pushing those forward. And then I think we will reap the dividends of successful pushing forward on these, whether you call them implementation or something else, through the coming years after the brunt of the pandemic is behind us. One other point which I do want to mention is one area where I honestly feel that in the last 4 or 5 years we've gone a bit backwards, which is our engagement with the rest of the world when it comes to foreign trade and international economics. We have tended to be a little protectionist when it comes to things like customs tariffs increases and so forth, or not participating in the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I think that if India is to go forward in the decades ahead and get to 5 trillion, we have to lose our sense of fear and worries about particular sectional interests and plunge ahead and do what we did in the spirit of 91 once again. Thank you.
Fair point, Dr. Acharya. But Nandan, I want to ask you, a lot is said about 1990 when and Dr. Manmohan Singh's role as ushering in an era of reforms. But in the conversation that we've had today, all of us here have recorded a lot of reform measures taken by the Modi government. I want to ask you, will history be more charitable to these reform decisions taken by the Modi government than the present politics has been? Because a lot of these reforms have been enumerated both by Uday, Kotak and Dr. Acharya and of course Mr. N.K. Singh. Do you think the Modi government has done political reforms like Article 370 abrogation along with economic reforms like GST, farm laws, etc., than we care to actually acknowledge?
Well, I think certainly there has been a whole spate of reforms on the economic side. Reforms, of course, GST, in my view, has been a huge success and is now generating huge amounts of revenue. The digital transformation has been a great success. The reforms in labor, of course, agriculture reforms also are there on the table, but it's stuck in some politics. I think there are a lot of, and I think the efforts to shrink the number of PSU banks and ultimately to privatize them, I think that's also a huge reform. So I think there are a lot of very, very good reforms that are going on. But I think the thing is that we cannot rest on that. We have many more reforms to be done if we have to get to a $5 trillion economy in the next 5 to 10 years.
Very well said. And Mr. N.K. Singh, I come back to you for your concluding remarks. And I must ask you, I can't make it easy for you because you've been on both sides of the aisle, in politics as well as in bureaucracy, in the Prime Minister's office as well as, crafting budgets. So I want to ask you, Mr. N.K. Singh, despite the fact that there is such a huge majority for Prime Minister Modi, do you think the pace of reforms that have been followed in the last 7 years are fast enough, number one? And number two, why are we going through times where there is so much of cacophony, and not just cacophony, but just legislation that is met with so many roadblocks? For example, the agriculture reforms that all of you have spoken about. We don't seem to be seeing those going forward. They've been put on the back burner for now. What is it that will take to break this political impasse?
Navika, I think that first of all, let me just make one comment that I broadly agree with a number of points made by Shankar, by Uday, and by also by Nandan. I agree that perhaps our pace of implementation and the returns on time have to be much faster for India to really gain its rightful position in the Committee of Nations as a real economic powerhouse and to enhance the current leadership, which Mr. Modi has sought to really reposition India in multiple ways. Shankar, I agree with you that the issue of foreign trade and making foreign trade as a true engine of growth is an issue which deserves high priority. But I'll make 2 points on that and then answer your question very directly. Now, I think one of the factors to realize, Uday and Shankar, you and I, we work together, is a risk-averse in the bureaucracy in general. This is something which is continuing, and the risk-averseness emanates of whether they would retrospectively held account for actions which they had undertaken at that time. And no other leadership in recent time has assured the bureaucracy that their bona fide actions have fullest protection and their fullest support. Indeed, efforts have been made, changed the Prevention of Corruption Act, set such bona fide decision-making by the bureaucracy. But I agree that much faster judicial reform, pace of dispute resolution, that's an area on which much more needs to be done, greater dialogue between the Supreme Court, the higher judiciary, and the Indian system. As we go forward, and as I mentioned about innovation, no other leadership in the recent past has been better positioned to take difficult action with panache, and if consultations have failed, then to act in overall it. We realize many of the reforms are really not very populist. They could be, in some way, the agitation could be popular, but nonetheless, it speaks to the credit of the present leadership that these reforms, we talked about consultations on farm reform. We forget the fact that 3 successive governments had approved the contours of the present Agricultural Produce Marketing Act. How much are more consultations are? And if the leadership did not really use parliamentary majority to push through issues of labor, land, land one that has been slackening, but on account of the recalcitrance of the states, but on factors of production, which we had, then I think that we would have lost out on time. Now, I think that as we go forward, I would say 2 things. One, I think the Prime Minister is best positioned to take the greater stakeholding role of the federal states, reinforcing the degree of federal fraternity, if I may use that expression, which goes beyond mere federal trust, goes certainly much beyond federal fiscal action, is a necessary road forward which will enable much faster pace of economic. The dialogue in Delhi has been replicated in Lucknow, in Patna, in Hyderabad, and other parts of India to really make the foundations of the new strategy of economic reforms and give it and invest it with the degree of momentum which it needs. Finally, I think that the Prime Minister, who has taken some very decisive steps, and these decisive steps taken by the Finance Minister, which shows the new mindset, as I said, on private capital, on harnessing the innovation and harnessing what technology has to offer, then I think that, frankly speaking, would have laid a very strong foundation. I agree that much faster pace of implementation in concert with the states and investing bureaucracy with renewed confidence on shedding off the risk averseness is the forward path. There's an old saying, and I would end with this generosity which you have with which you have tolerated this little comment by me. I'm always reminded of what the great philosopher Albert Camus had said, that success, in a sense, is a bondage because it unleashes expectations to improve on the success. No other leadership, recent past, has been bonded to his success in as much measure and in expectation of what holds of this leadership than the current political leadership.
Absolutely. And the time really is now to step up the pace of these reforms. What happened 30 years ago showed us the way, but we cannot rest on those laurels because we are today part of a generation that's coming up in India that wants changes fast and to keep pace with the international world. We will have to move fast. There is no option. How are we going to resolve the differences at a federal level is something we as a nation will have to think about. States becoming impediments for the center or the center becoming impediment for the states is not a model that's going to be acceptable in India anymore, because time is running out and everybody wants these changes to happen now, not later. Thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening discussion with such eminent panelists on this panel. And for us here at Times Now, it's been a pleasure to host all of you, not just to reminisce about 1991, but also look at the road forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Uday Kotak, Mr. Nandan Nilekani, Dr. Shankar Acharya, and Mr. N.K. Singh for joining me here on the Newshour at 9.